All right. So thank you everybody for joining. Appreciate the time. We don't have a lot of time today, so we're going to get through the next 30 minutes. Hopefully, provide some valuable content. We're going to go through a few questions. Like I said, it's not a very long webinar. We want to make the most use of this time, so we're going to go through a few questions. Feel free to use the chat feature to ask any questions real time. We may not get to each of those questions, but what we're planning to do is be able to answer those questions after this webinar, either via follow-up email or video. So what I also want to let you all know is this is part one of a multi-part series. Part two is going to be coming out in a couple weeks, and you'll get some more information about that tomorrow in a follow-up email, along with some additional resources we're going to be able to provide. So, Mark, are you with us? Oh, I think we're having some audio difficulty. We've actually rehearsed this a couple times, and wouldn't you know, day of go live, we've got some audio issues, and that's okay. We'll get through this. But you may be asking, why are these two guys together, and why now? And really, Mark is an executive coach. He's a business strategist. I have been called by some an expert in technology and security, and I'll take that. And we've known each other for quite some time. And we've recently noticed that some of our respective clients are having similar conversations, and they're asking about how to address problems that they had not seen before. And we originally thought, maybe this is coming about because of the COVID crisis, and that could be part of the case. But it really was starting to show that there were underlying issues that could no longer be avoided. And that's what really prompted us to say, okay, we're both experiencing similar conversations with our clients around different subject matters. Why not put together a webinar and share this information with a wider audience? And so that's why we're here today. That's what we're here to do. And I want to welcome back Mark. There he is on the mic.
Don. Hey, Don, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah,
thanks for joining, Mark. All right, Mark. So I kind of gave the intro here, and talked about, why us, why now, why is a business coach and executive coach and the strategist coming together with cybersecurity and technology guy. We're having similar conversations like we've been talking about, and so. Mark, what I want to talk about right now, I'm excited for you to share what you're seeing right now. Tell us some of the stories that you're having with clients.
So, Don, what we usually do is we always bring you in when we have technology problems. So now we obviously need you for that always. Okay, so we're going to make sure that always happens. And the next thing is that, I think it's really valuable, just as we take this time, to be completely transparent. No matter how many times you test things, and Don and I are both kind of technical. I mean, we know enough. That doesn't mean when you go live, there's not going to be problems. And that's the beauty, is that when you're going through issues like this, you can try to hide them. But if you communicate them and say, hey, listen, this is just the way sometimes things go, that's really important. Which reminds me of one of the stories. I have a client that I've been working with, and they're in construction and building industry, and they have about 130 employees. Well, the CEO was always willing to listen to employees, always listen to what's going on, was willing to go and implement new things and changes. And even though they're a profitable business, one of the things that we saw is that sometimes communication can break down when you start to get different locations, when you start to grow, when you start to take on new tasks. And one of the things I remind people is divisions create divisions. Sometimes when you start to segment people into different areas, you're actually going to create silos. So one of the questions, and I want to get right to this, Don, just like we talked about, and we want this to be 30 minutes of questions that literally people can ask right away, is how has distance, different offices, the growth of the organization, or changes in locations negatively impacted your organization's communication? That's the key question. But what you're going to ask your team is, what has changed in the way that we communicate that you want to improve? And what simple first steps do you want to see us do? Because that's the key between Don and I, we're talking, is that if you don't communicate, or you communicate in a way where people don't understand what you're trying to get across, that's the disconnect. Don, where have you seen that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna tell you a similar story that I've been having with my clients. One thing I failed to mention at the top of this webinar is that if you don't get these questions written down, don't worry. We're going to be providing some follow-up resources tomorrow, and we'll have these questions that we're asking along with additional questions. So that's what I first wanted to say. If you didn't quite mark down what Mark just said, don't worry. Those questions will be coming, as well as the questions that I'm going to answer on today's call as well. So, Mark, I've been having some recent conversations actually with a variety of clients, healthcare, manufacturing, financial services. The interesting thing is I'm getting similar questions. They're not always worded the same, but a similar theme is coming through. And it's not a question I hear all the time. In fact, unfortunately, a lot of times, I don't get called in. Like you mentioned, Mark, you may not call the technology guy until there's a visible problem, right? Until your mic doesn't work on a live webinar. No, right? But I like to be proactive, and that doesn't always happen. But what I'm getting from these clients is, and this may be, again, being prompted because they have more employees working from home. But the question that keeps coming up is, how do I know that my IT team has everything under control? It's a very broad question and not one that can easily be answered. But that's what I'm starting to receive back from clients lately. And those are the questions that are being asked. And so when you think about kind of those good old days before this pandemic, was your technology and cybersecurity plan perfect? Probably not. You may not have even thought about it because you just kind of figured, IT's got this handled. But maybe that wasn't truly the case. And so here's what you can ask your team. Where is there room for improvement in how our company manages technology? And the reason you phrase it that way is that it invites conversation and dialogue. It invites communication, like Mark has been talking about. It's not a yes/no question, right? It says, look, I know there's probably a lot of room for improvement in different ways. Can you give me some examples? And it doesn't come down on that IT team as you're not doing a good job. It invites them to add some conversation and some value into what's happening in the organization. And one quick thing I'll mention on that before I turn it back over to Mark is when you think about the transition from primarily workers in the office to remote workers and what that impact is long term, purely from a security standpoint, I think of network security versus data security. When everybody's in the same building, the controls around the building can help protect your data. When everybody's outside of the building, those need to shift. And that may be where some of your IT team or your security team is thinking about things for improvement. So Mark, I know I'm gonna turn it back over to you to talk about how you are engaging clients around adapting to new ideas and new concepts.
Yeah, thanks, Don. And I wanted to mention something that you just spoke about. It's when you phrase a question a certain way to IT or anyone, when you're not attacking them with a why didn't you or why won't you versus how can we collaborate? That's what communication is about. And that's where I saw the bridge. I was like, we're really trying to say the same thing. We're just trying to help leaders have better dialogue, but also help IT teams be able to do their jobs. So not only they satisfy security needs, but they also satisfy the needs of the users, no matter what location they're at. And that's one of the things is that people have been forced recently because of the crisis to do things they've never really done, or it was on their to-do list. And we are going to test this out. And this is what's happening. People are learning a lot, forced or not, about change. And those things that were put off, and that means, hey, let's go and find a different way and different technology to communicate. Let's find out, can remote workers really work in a different location and be effective and efficient? And we're going to also touch on a question later that talks about what's this affected with my home life. It's not just about work and profit. It's also about people and why they work and what goes on now that we've invaded their homes. So the question I want you to really think about is now having to quickly adapt to these new concepts, to plans and process that was really unexpected. Ask your team, due to our organizational changes, what is the one thing you want us to stop doing, one thing to start doing, and one thing that needs to change, right? And continue. So think about that. There's things that in your organization that it really needs to stop. And this change has really proven that this really is the pivot point. But presenting that back to management, presenting that back to leadership, that communication is a great place to start. So, Don, do you get to ever have a problem when you kind of add things and not take things away? How's that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, I think, a tendency to always add, not always, I shouldn't say always, but a tendency to add tools and different things into the technology stack that may be perceived as necessary. But I want to think back to some of the basics around even just security, and think about something that maybe you want to start doing. And where I kind of go with this is, thinking about how your organizations communicate with employees, provide examples, resources, tips, information related to cybersecurity. I see that as a big gap, and a conversation that I continually have with clients and businesses of all sizes is, maybe, if your employees are not educated, if they kind of see cybersecurity as this black box of mysterious tools and whiz bangs and gadgets and whatnot, they may not know how to respond appropriately when they're put in a different environment, put in remote work, alternative work environment, however you want to call it, where new threats may be coming their way. And so the way that you could phrase this to your team and attempt to lead them down that road and that kind of conversation is, has remote work introduced additional security risks? And if so, what actions should we be taking right now and in the future? And so again, you may not be getting the exact answer that I just talked about around cybersecurity education. There could be other things that come up, but the way you phrase that, and again, invite some dialogue and some conversation. The reality is threats are changing daily. And when I think back to what can we add now as far as cybersecurity training, a lot of organizations are still doing that once a year, 45-minute security awareness training. That really doesn't work, doesn't do well for your employees, doesn't equip them well, especially when they're thrust into a new environment. So ask the question that way, see if you can start to dialogue that out with your IT and security team.
So Don, what you're really saying is that people have to be aware, because they're going to see things a lot sooner than sometimes other people in the organization. And it doesn't really matter how many certifications you have to start having that dialogue.
Absolutely. And the reality is that the folks that are going to a lot of times see those kind of threats come into the organization, could be frontline workers, that again, you may not have provided the right education to know what to look for. They could also be highly targeted users, like your executive team, that you have allowed certain freedoms with, let's say, on the network that you may not allow others. And I think we've all dealt with that. It's, they may have more freedom to do things on the network and then thus get themselves in bigger trouble by clicking on the wrong link or whatnot. So again, target those that if you want to start an education program to those that may be more targeted than the rest of your environment, that's okay too. Think of the folks in finance. I had a client, and I'll tell this brief story. So I'm sorry to ad lib here, Mark, but I wanted to interject this brief story about a financial services client that was starting to see some anomalous activity, some behavior that just didn't make sense on the network, emails that were coming in, asking very specific questions of very specific people. And as I started to help kind of uncover and ask questions, I just went out to LinkedIn and started looking through their employee roster. Come to find out, the person that was in charge of accounts receivable and accounts payable had that listed publicly on their LinkedIn profile, essentially saying everything related to finance for this company, come to me, target me. I'm the one-stop shop. And she was the one that was being targeted with these spear phishing campaigns. So when you think about who needs that education, think about the finance department too. So I know that was a long-winded response, Mark, but I thought what better time to take the opportunity to talk about that now.
It brings up something that I think bridges between both of us that I ask every one of my clients. And I say, during the last 30 to 45 days, answer these 3 questions for yourself. You really should ask this to everyone on your team and say, what are you learning about people outside of your organization? What are you learning about people inside your organization? And what are you learning about yourself? Now, those seem like really simple questions, but the reason why they're important is because you just went through a crisis. And even though people say we're all in the same boat, that doesn't mean we all experienced it the same way. So if that's the case, and we aren't all experiencing things the same way, what are you noticing about what you're seeing out there in the world, how people are reacting? What are you admiring? And what are you looking and saying that you are concerned about? And that's even in your organization, which you may have more control. And if you have more control, what are you going to do about what you see? And then personally, what is going on? And this leads to what Don and I are both saying, because some of this could be security, but some of this can also be behavioral. So some of this can be things, but if you don't start really focusing and asking and really drilling down, these really get missed, which, Don, leads to one of the questions that we got that really almost doesn't have anything to do with work, but it really has everything to do.
It does. And so as we were preparing for this webinar, we used several methods for collecting some feedback, asking questions that folks wanted to hear about. So one of the questions, we collected this off of social media. In fact, it was off of a LinkedIn post that we wanted to take an opportunity to answer. Kind of hits closer to home on the personal side, kind of shoves the business to the side, so to speak, and gets to the heart of what's happening with your team. And so here's the question. And here's the question we want to think about, and you want to think about when you're thinking about your team. Leaders should ask about the welfare of their teams right now, especially with the current situation. Ask how they are coping, and ask how you can help. So, Mark, when you think about that question, what comes to mind for you?
I think, part of the focus for me with working with leaders is always to make them think about their life outside of work as much as they think about their life inside work. Right? Because we work for a reason. But what this crisis did is allow people to see inside people's homes, right? There used to be a barrier where sometimes the only time you would work, right? You're working out of your home, right?
Right.
Home offices. The thing is that when you would work, you might have your phone and be working from home, but now you're actually at your kitchen table and there's your dog and then there's your kids and then there's your parents or grandparents you're worried about. The thing is that what I'm getting from this question, what I'm asking a lot of other people is that as a leader, you have to start being more aware of people's lives outside of work, because now it is your business because they're inviting you in their homes. So you can ask and they have the right to answer and say, listen, I don't want to talk about it. Or, wow, thanks. I've worked here for 7 years. And this is the first time you actually asked me if I had kids or what's going on in my life. Thank you, because this is what's going on. And then you find out that you actually go to the same church or you actually live in the same neighborhood. And there's a lot of things that you're like, didn't even know. I think that we overlook too many times how the reason people work is they want to provide for their families. And now this is bridging that gap. And leaders really have to start taking more care and concern. And that's harder for leaders who used to always distance things and separate and silo. Don, what are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I think this comes down to empathy, right? And I know I've done enough of those personality, behavioral, strength finder tests. Empathy is not something that is innate for me. It's something I have to work at. So I have a tendency to put blinders on and just go after these goals, right? I'm a hard charging A-type. Let's just keep going, right? Well, my wife reminds me from time to time that I need to be empathetic for what other people are going through, which is true. It just doesn't come naturally. So as a leader, if that doesn't come naturally to you, you may be doing this well with your team right now, but I know there's a lot, including myself, that again isn't something you naturally do. So when I think about this, I think about, you're right, Mark, there's folks that are sitting at their kitchen table, sitting on the couch, sitting in their bedrooms. They may not have an office that they can close off and get some privacy. So check in with your team, see what you can do for them, see what they're struggling with. Think about, you may have team members that have family in some of the harder hit areas like New York or other parts of the world even. So while you think they may be engaged and they're present, they're not on PTO or vacation, there's a lot of things that are weighing on them. I'll also mention that just from an attention standpoint, there's a lot going on, right? It's not just what's happening at work. There's a lot of things happening in everybody's personal life. It's a great time, unfortunately, for bad actors to take advantage of that and to start attacking organizations, which is happening. So I want to warn people of that. Right now, when people are distracted, it's unfortunately an opportunity for more bad things to happen. So think about that as as we talked about before, and as you're thinking about what's happening in the lives of your employees. Great.
And Don, I want to make sure people know what kind of clients you work with. So, you mentioned a bunch of different sectors and different industries, but tell people who you've recently helped and how that's kind of worked out.
Yeah, it's a good question. So as we wrap up towards the end of our webinar here, I'm going to tell one more story, and it's a financial services client, this particular solution that we worked on. But what I'll say is, even if that's not your industry, or if you're in a completely different industry, the solutions that we talked about with this client that we helped implement work regardless of what industry you're in. It really came down to, they have some sensitive data. They have an application that needed to be available 24/7. And that application included some very sensitive data. Okay. They happen to be financial services, but those circumstances could apply to any industry. And we started, they started asking, can we do this? Can we do this? And I said, you know what, let's pause. What are you trying to achieve? That's where we started. Let's ask some questions. Let's bring it out. Let's figure out, is it a technology issue? Maybe what the technology you have in place is just fine. We just need to tweak some business processes. So we started with, what are you trying to achieve? And had several conversations around that. And then we helped design a solution that not only increased their productivity for their finance and operations department, but it gave peace of mind to the executive team and the board that their application was going to be available and that their data was going to be as secure as possible. So Mark, that's my story. What do you, who have you worked with recently that's benefited significantly around team communication?
It's funny. We both start with the same thing. We start with asking good questions, right? Both of our industries really have to be about not, hey, this is what we're going to solve. First, I got to know what you're trying to accomplish. And that's why I like working with you, Don, is that you don't just go in and do just like, well, I'm going to solve it because you definitely need this. It's like, no, everybody doesn't need everything exactly the same. What I do is I work with leaders that are actually humble enough to say that they wanted to improve the way they communicate with their team. Humble enough to say there's something to learn, and that they're willing to go and say, well, there might be something to improve in a way where I want to make sure what I'm saying is actually getting implemented and executed, and I'm not excluding people. But this isn't soft and mushy. Again, I'm a guy from New Jersey, so I'm not going to go and be like, oh, I'm not a cheerleader. The thing is that not that there's anything wrong with being a cheerleader at sometimes, to be around and rally around people. What it's about is that make sure if you say you're going to do something, I want to show you how to be able to make that happen. And I think that's what we both do, Don. We say, if you want to accomplish this, these are the steps, and this is the way it happens to be able to bring it together. And as we're kind of wrapping up and thinking about this, I want you to know that there are times where, one webinar is just not going to solve all the problems. It's not going to explain everything that needs to go. This is where you reach out to us and have that conversation.
Absolutely. And so I put our contact information up there. You can kind of see what we do and some of our expertise, phone numbers and email addresses. Feel free to jot those down. Again, we'll send you the recording after this, so you'll have that information and some additional resources that we're going to provide. So hopefully everybody can see that. I'm going to go back to the slide. And so what Mark was talking about is our next webinar. So in a couple weeks, you'll actually be able to join us again, and we're going to talk about, we talked today about questions, right? And so getting some of those answers, which is fantastic. And that's where you start. And Mark shared, I shared about some of the conversations we're having with clients, asking those right questions. But those questions then turn into action or attempted action, and you need to get consensus. So we're going to be talking about getting consensus and what that looks like, even if you don't have 100% agreement. So be on the lookout for that email that's coming out tomorrow. It's going to have the opportunity to sign up for our next webinar. And additional resources, again, around the questions we asked today, some additional questions that we didn't get to today. And I noticed in the chat window, we actually have several questions that have come into the moderator. Unfortunately, we are wrapping up our time. We've got 1 minute left in our 30-minute window today, and we want to be respectful of that time. So we're going to hold answering those questions until after this webinar. You'll see a follow-up from us answering the remainder of those questions. So thank you all for joining us today. Mark, thank you for co-hosting with me. And we look forward to seeing you all in a couple weeks.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Everybody have a good one.